Thank you very much, Dylan. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, I'm a computer scientist. I appreciate that I'm talking to rather a different audience today. I hope you find this interesting. I've tried to keep this very high level and try to convey some of the ideas that we're working on when we think about, can we create, using artificial intelligence, ecosystems of evolving robots. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So I think it's probably clear to everybody that robotics is now really part of our everyday lives. If we look around us, we see very big use of robots, like you see in the left in hospital situations. They're used a lot in manufacturing, in warehouses. You see there some of the Amazon robots that basically are capable of picking up packages off shelves and delivering them to sorting places. And even in our homes, you can buy for not very much money these days these robot cleaners. So all of the things that you see here are designed by human engineers with very good knowledge of robotics and engineering. And they're designed to do a very specific task. So that's especially true in the case of the medical robots, but even the Amazon robots and the Roomba, although they're going to come across different situations in the course of their kind of everyday job, if you like, it's relatively straightforward for the designer to figure out what kind of things that the robot might come across and therefore program it in order to deal with these situations. So although, you know, you can't perhaps envisage everything, it's pretty straightforward to think about the sort of general categories of things that the robot might have to do. And then you design with that in mind. But what if you want to design robots to use in an environment that you don't know anything about? So for example, cleaning up inside a nuclear reactor, maybe mining minerals at the bottom of the sea, sending them off to a faraway comet or planet where you want them to do something. And in all of these situations, you don't know what the robot might encounter. So that makes it very difficult as an engineer to try and design with these things in mind. And it's particularly problematic, for example, if you want to send robots into space. You know, imagine designing a robot to send to some faraway comet to explore. It takes 10 years to get there. And when it gets there, you find it doesn't have the right means of locomotion or the right actuators to kind of pick up rocks or do whatever you wanted it to do. So then you've wasted a great deal of money and time. So this kind of really got us thinking, could we basically use something like an artificial version of evolution to allow robots to design themselves in situ? So could you build a kind of fabrication system that you could send to a planet, and it would basically design the robots in situ, build them, allow them to live in their environment, and then gradually over time improve the robots in this kind of autonomous way so that they fully adapt to the environments that they live in? So that's a vision for very far in the future. But we basically set ourselves a challenge of thinking, well, what would you need in place to realize that vision? So this idea of evolution, like why think that this could be good for robots? Well, we know that evolution is really good at creating species and animals that can exist very well in their own particular niche and adapt to their environment. So for example, in the rainforest, you find these plants like the one on the left that have evolved leaves that are shaped exactly like satellite dishes. And these amplify signals that bats send out, which attract the bats to the flowers, and then the flowers get more pollinated. So it's a very nice kind of piece of design that evolution has come up with. You see it in lots of animal species. This okapi here has many adaptations that make it very fit for its environment, in its camouflage, in the scent glands on its feet that allow it to mark its territory. It has a particular long tongue that allows it to eat certain things. So if we look to the natural world, that we see evolution as a tool is very good for designing things that adapt to their environment. So could we build a kind of artificial form of evolution that would allow us to enable a robot population to do exactly the same thing and adapt to the environment that they live in? And it's not as far-fetched as you might think, because this idea of actually using artificial evolution to evolve things actually goes right back to the 1960s, when actually people had very little computing power. So it was kind of invented simultaneously in Europe and in the States, two groups that came up with basically the same thing. This is a bunch of German PhD students who in 1964 basically wrote the first evolutionary algorithm, a model of evolution running inside a computer to tackle this engineering problem. And it was actually to design, to optimize the kind of angles on this plate that you see here. So this made the news even back in 1964 about these engineers trying to copy Darwin's ideas. And actually they went on to do some interesting things, which actually threw up some interesting facts. So this is another example from the same group. And what you see here is it's a gas nozzle where gas has to flow through the pipe, and what you want to do is maximize the flow of gas through the pipe. And they use this artificial version of evolution to optimize the shape of this pipe. And what you see is that you end up with this pipe that looks really bizarre from an engineer's point of view. It's not something that people taught standard engineering techniques at the time would have designed. Yet this artificial evolutionary process was able to come up with this, this odd looking thing that actually provided a better solution to the problem than anything that engineers had built. Of course, it was very difficult to do at the time. So they didn't obviously have very good computer technology back in 1968. And every time evolution threw up a new design in their computer, they actually had to build it and then test it and then feed some information back to the computer that allowed the design to evolve. But this really kind of set off a whole field that really made people think, well, maybe we could use this artificial evolutionary technique, not only just to solve problems, but also to actually be creative and come up with things that perhaps humans wouldn't have thought of, because we taught in certain ways and we think about things in certain ways, but whereas evolution doesn't have any of those constraints. So back in the sort of early days of the field, sort of late 60s, early 70s, of course, the toolbox available to people to try and build artificial evolutionary algorithms was very basic. They had very basic computers with hardly any power. They had the beginnings of a theory of artificial evolution and why it might, in theory, be able to solve problems in a reasonable amount of time. But now we've got much better things at our disposal that have really kind of kickstarted the field and enabled us to do lots of really interesting things. So for example, we have, everybody in their phone has a pretty decent amount of power, but we have huge clusters with a huge amount of CPU and GPU power. We have excellent simulations that are really able to accurately simulate on a computer really accurate physics. So you can really simulate physical interactions between, for example, a robot walking on the ground and measure and use friction and gravity in exactly the same way that you would use in the real world. We have a better understanding of the theory of artificial evolution and a better understanding of essentially how to create a representation of DNA inside a computer, because just like DNA is the kind of building blocks of everything that evolution does, if we're going to do this in an artificial sense, we need an artificial representation of DNA that can also evolve. We have, in terms of robotics, new ways of building things. So rather than just building things out of, let's say, metal or hard plastics, there's now lots of, this is really in terms of robotics, lots of soft materials that are able to flex and bend. So you can make robots that look much more like snakes that can squeeze through gaps. And this has really opened up the design space that gives our artificial evolutionary tools kind of something to work with. And this is really also facilitated by the ability to 3D print all kinds of materials, which enables rapid prototyping of evolutionary designs, and actually using kind of the sort of automated systems that you see in factories allows the whole process of the 3D printing and assembling robots to be built. So all of these things together really give us like basically an amazing set of tools that allow us to really think about applying an artificial version of evolution to design physical objects. So there's been lots of interesting things designed by artificial evolutionary algorithms across the years. So back in 2006, this was a piece of work by NASA. This is part of, it's a communications antenna that went on a satellite. It was designed by Evolution, and you can again see it's a kind of really weird shape. It's not a shape that engineers would have come up with. And this was actually put up on a satellite and sent into space. So that was kind of the first artificially evolved thing in space, I guess. And since then, particularly with the advance in sort of CAD software, it's been used as a tool to design things. So I'm not entirely sure what that is. It's part of I think it's part of a motorbike or something. It's a joint in it. And so what you see on the left is the kind of original design. And then on the right, you see some designs that Evolution has come up with that are made out of different materials. They're much lighter, but they're equally as strong. And so this is really advantageous if you can build things that essentially achieve the same function, but use less material and are perhaps even stronger than the original thing that was made out of metal. Just to show you a couple more things. So it's also been used in architecture, and in fact, increasingly so in building design. So here's an example of a layout of a building, and Evolution here was asked to come up with a design where basically you could maximize the amount of sunlight that got into the building while maintaining certain kind of criteria about how much sunlight, how much floor area there was and things like that. So this is a design where Evolution is basically given some goals. Please design me a building that meets these criteria, and it can come up with some new designs. And in fact, it's increasingly being used in the architecture field, particularly with an eye on sustainability and how you can design buildings that have, you know, are easier to keep cool without using vast amounts of electricity and have better airflow and things like that. The one on the right is some work that a colleague of mine did with Honda. It's designing a very efficient wing mirror for a car. And again, the evolution process here is basically tweaking the design of the wing mirror to make it be very effective in terms of the kind of airflow and the drag on the mirror. So evolution is really being used, artificial evolution is being used in a lot of cases, applied to a lot of different types of tasks. Just one more example. This is a competition that runs every year at a conference I go to. It's using evolution inside Minecraft to design interesting structures. And you can, this is the advert for the competition, but you can just run that again. You can see, I'll start again, some of the sort of interesting things that are grown inside this Minecraft environment. So it's a tool now that really is being used a lot in design in the real world. But if we want to start thinking about robotics, it's quite a big leap from using evolution to design passive objects such as antennas for satellites or wing mirrors for cars, to thinking about designing moving objects such as robots, which obviously have a physical shape, but they also have to be able to sense their environment around them in order to interact with it. They've got to feed that information about what they're sensing back to some kind of brain, and that brain has got to decide how to make the robot react. Therefore, it has to have some kind of actuators. It needs some legs or some wheels in order to make it move. So this is much more difficult than using evolution to design a static or passive object like we see on the left, because now we need to really think about evolution designing, just like in biology, the entire thing, the body and the brain of the robot. And it makes things much more difficult. And it's also difficult because there's a lot of interesting work about intelligence and why things have the sort of shape they have. And there's a very interesting book that came out, I don't know, 10, maybe 15 years ago, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think, which is really about this interaction between body and brain, and actually the fact that intelligence doesn't have to just lie in your brain. By having a kind of smart body, let's say, and an intelligently designed body, then you can actually devolve some of the effort in controlling that body to basically the physical the physical description of the body itself. So it's like what it's made out of, the shape of it, how it interacts with it in its environment. So if you basically have something that's like springy, you can make movement a lot easier, because you can basically take account of natural forces without having to actually put energy into like electrical energy into to make the robot move. So this also kind of makes this task of designing robots more difficult, because we have to decide, where does this balance of intelligence lie? Is it in the body? Is it in the brain? Where on the scale should we sort of put the effort? But it's partly why using artificial evolution is a nice thing here, because we can kind of devolve that to the evolutionary process and ask it to come up with something that meets the criteria that we want, but it can worry about what's the right shape, what's the right materials, what's the right sensors and actuators to make that happen, and what's the right controller to deal with all that information that's coming from the sensors and feed that back into the actuation. So actually evolution kind of is our friend here, because we can let evolution simultaneously worry about what is the best combination of body and brain to do the task that we want. So I thought I would just show you some examples of things that people have tried to do in this sphere. So it goes back like 20 years now, when people first tried to use artificial evolution to simultaneously evolve the bodies and the brains of robots. So this is a fairly simple one. What I show you on the top video is a simulation. So this is evolution in simulation. Is that video playing? Okay, for some reason that's not playing. Sit to the bottom up. Okay, oh dear. Okay, for some reason these videos are not playing. I'm not sure I can fix that. This is a shame. So what you see on the top is the simulation. So the evolution process comes up with this small robot that you see at the top. I don't know why they're not playing. And then after evolution has designed a whole host of them, they pick the best ones and they build them. And you should, but not here, working. You see them working for real. So this is very nice. It designed a moving robot that was able to move around, but it didn't have any sensing ability. So it can move in its environment, but it has no mechanism for sensing. Okay, here is, oh yeah, this one is working, good. Okay, so this was a few years later. So this is now taking account of the fact that you can design using soft materials, that basically you can fire a current through and it causes the material to expand and contract. So again, they evolved this robot purely in simulation, and then after the simulation, they built it out of these soft materials. And if I just start the video again, you can see here, so the evolutionary process is coming up with the design. There are two different types of materials, the orange and the white, and they basically expand and contract at different rates. And because of the different rates, you basically get this kind of movement across the screen. So then they built these again, and basically showed that the thing that was evolved in simulation could then actually be used in the real world. So this is interesting because of the use of novel materials. Again, it doesn't have any sensing ability. It's really robots that are able to move in an environment, but not sense their environment. So if we move on, again, can we get these videos? Okay, so you can see here. So this is actually a kit that you can buy on the internet. It basically provides a software tool that has the evolutionary part built in and allows the evolution to design the robots a bit like what you see in the top there. Let me just replay that again. But then the kit always also comes with, the parts, which enables you to build what the evolutionary process is designed. So this is a little bit more limiting, I think, because it's made of these fixed modules. So evolution can only build things here out of these modular blocks, which tend to be kind of square blocks. So you tend to get a lot of like snake-like robots, but it some senses limits the sort of the creativity of what can be built. This is very recent work. This is really groundbreaking work. So again, it's robots evolved in software and then hand built. But the really incredible thing with this work is that after they evolve in software, they actually hand build the robots using living stem cells made from frogs. So I'm just going to play this and show you what they did. So they use evolution in a computer, and it evolves these different shapes of robots. And they basically just say, find something that moves as fast as possible. And you can see the kind of things that the evolution comes up with. And then they actually build these from living stem cells. So you see the simulated robot on the left and the real robot on the right, and the video. So now you can see a video of the, under a microscope, obviously, of the actual living robot produced from these stem cells. And you can see that it moves much like the simulated version. So this is just it speeded up. And if I just, and they did all kinds of cool things where they basically show that even if you flip it over, it can still move. And if we just move it forward a wee bit, you can see that they even designed ones that could basically push things around and scoop up things. So this is really interesting work, because it really is the world's first living robots, if you like, completely designed by an artificial, I'm just going to stop that there. You can find these videos on YouTube and look in much more detail. So this is, it's really a leap forward to be able to design something using evolution and simulation and then actually build it in real life. But again, these robots didn't have sensors, and to some extent they're modular. So one thing about doing things in simulation and then building them in reality is that quite often the thing you build in reality doesn't match the simulation. So a recent thing that people have been doing is trying to get around this by doing the evolution completely in hardware. So this is an example from a group in Cambridge where everything is done in hardware now. Basically, there's no simulation part of it. Everything is automated. Again, it doesn't have sensors. It has a kind of DNA or a genome that basically describes what modules should be used, how they should join together, and how they should work. And if I show you this video, so they call this the sort of mother robot. And what it does is it creates a piece of artificial DNA, which says, this is what a robot should look like. It automatically builds a robot. It squirts out some glue. I don't know if you see that very clearly. Glues the blocks together. So it builds the robot completely automatically. It adds in some motors that allow it to move. And then it basically places it in an arena and watches it with a camera and sees how well it works. And this gives it a sort of fitness evaluation. And then based on how well the robot is perceived to perform, that's used to drive a sort of selection process, just like natural selection, that decides which robots get to reproduce. And so here's one you can see now. It's not a very good one, it falls off the table, but you can see the idea. So this again is a big step forward. This is another version of this. So this is a bit more like a biological system, I guess. So here the evolution process is decentralized. You have robots moving around an arena. When two robots come into physical contact with each other, they exchange their genetic material that basically describes how they're built. That's undergoes a crossover mutation process, and it produces a new genetic code for a new robot, which is then built. So you can see on the right, this blue and the green robot have swapped their DNA, and now you get something that's a bit of a mixture between the blue and the green robot. So this all happens again in reality. There's no simulation here, and it adds in this element of robots having to meet to interact. So basically, this leads me on to some work that I'm doing in collaboration with my colleagues in York and Bristol in Amsterdam. So this was our kind of long-term vision to build this thing we call the EvoSphere, which would enable this kind of evolution of robot populations on a faraway planet. It has some kind of fabrication system that basically designs and builds the robots. Once they're built, they go into some sort of training facility where, just like a sort of infant, they would basically refine their motor skills to learn how to move properly. When they've refined their skills, they go out into the real world and they're scored on their ability to conduct a task. And it's that score that basically drives an evolutionary cycle that chooses robots for reproduction, creates new ones, recycles the old ones. So this is a kind of cartoon vision of what we would really like to achieve. We've had quite a lot of attention from this. So there was a recent article in New Scientist and in The Guardian, and a TED talk that I gave that was released a couple of months ago that you can look at to get a bit more detail of this. This has also brought some negative publicity, let's say, but I'll come back to that later in the talk. Okay, so what we're trying to build is something like this, where basically we have an artificial process that creates artificial genomes that describe robots. They're sent to a system that basically creates the robots. They go into this training facility, they kind of undergo a test. If they can't move or they can't learn like to refine their motor control, we just throw them away. The ones that pass that test are moved into a real arena, and then they get evaluated on how good they are. And so they basically added to this gene pool. So our basically system looks like this. The evolution is the genomes are created on the computer. They're sent to this 3D printer that prints the parts. And then this arm assembles the thing into a real robot. And I'll show you that working in a minute. So what we actually do, because this evolving in physical systems, it's very slow, we actually mirror the physical system on a computer. So we have kind of two parallel worlds where evolution is happening very fast in the virtual world due to the power of computing, and a bit more slow in the physical world. But this gives us a kind of nice property, is that we can send good genomes from the virtual world to the physical world, which speeds up the evolution in the physical, sort of kickstarts a sort of new cycle of evolution in the physical world. We can send things back from the physical to the virtual, and this actually helps fix this reality gap, because it sort of puts robots that are good in the physical world back into the virtual one. We can even have a kind of hybridized form of reproduction where we take the genome of a virtual robot and the genome of a physical robot and mix them together to create a new robot. So it really allows us to kind of play with these evolutionary techniques. And this ecosystem manager is basically kind of managing everything. It's deciding this, it's basically in charge of the selection process. It's deciding which robots get to breed and which ones don't. It's monitoring this reality gap to figure out whether you should be favoring sending things from physical to virtual or virtual to physical. And it's basically updating some of the algorithmic parameters to decide, maybe robots need to learn a bit more before they're released into the real world, and this kind of thing. I'm not going to go into the details because of the time here. But basically, you can think of it as like a sort of interface that controls the two worlds. This can be a mixture of a human. Well, we should definitely have a human in the loop. I'll come back to this when I talk about some ethics shortly. Some of it can be kind of algorithmic or rule-based, that basically says, if this is happening, then do this. But a human can also be in the loop, a little bit like a plant breeder in genetics, in kind of trying to bias the evolution towards a certain kind of robot, or to change some things that are happening in the system. So to do this, there's also some engineering things. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but in order to be able to build these robots, in order to test them, you have to do some kind of novel things in engineering. So we use a mixture of 3D printing and a mixture of a kind of bank of components, which are the sensors and the motors that can be added to the robot. So the evolutionary process is essentially asked to design a skeleton of a robot, and then it basically, and to say where on the skeleton you should attach these various sensors, wheels. So it has access to various types of sensor, it has access to wheels, it has access to joints to make legs. So we built all of these by hand, and then the evolutionary process can just decide to choose them and use them or not. The robots are controlled by Raspberry Pi, which acts as the brain, and that always sits on top of the skeleton. Let me just show you the system running. So you can see here the assembly process. So here's a skeleton that's been pre-built. Here's the kind of bank of components. So this arm will do all of the assembly, including all of the cabling and wiring up the motors and sensors to the Raspberry Pi, and then creating the thing. So you can see it just attaches. So the design has come from evolution. It's designed the skeleton, and it says where the wheels should go. And then this process builds the robot completely autonomously. So a lot of the work that my colleagues have been doing, mainly in Bristol, is building this fabrication system to allow any design that the artificial evolutionary process comes up with to actually be built and then rapidly tested in some kind of mocked up scenario that we want the robots to be good at. Okay. So I don't want to talk particularly detailed about the sort of computer science things about how we build these algorithms, but I just wanted to touch on some of the things that are a little bit different if you're thinking about evolving robots rather than thinking about evolving biological systems. So if we look at biology, there is some evidence in the kind of genetic history of certain species that at certain points along the kind of evolutionary timescale, there's been some interspecies breeding. So if, for example, you look at the big cats, you can find some evidence that there has been breeding between different species of cats at some point way back in the past in evolutionary history. So a lot of this kind of interspecies breeding quite often, I believe, leads to a kind of evolutionary dead end, but occasionally it works okay. But what you don't get in biological species is something like this kind of cartoon where you get breeding between completely different species. But in artificial evolution, and particularly in evolving robots, this is exactly what we actually want to do, because we want to, for example, if we've got some unknown environment, we want to be able to take a robot that, for example, walks on legs, and a robot that has wheels, and perhaps they both have different kinds of sensors. And we want to be able to create and these robots, we want to be able to create a new robot that has some features of both of those robots. So for example, a robot that maybe has wheels at the back but legs at the front, because maybe that gives it an advantage in the fact that it's able to navigate different types of terrain. But what makes it hard, so it's relatively easy to kind of design an artificial process that allows this kind of crossover between different bodies to produce a robot body that inherits some features from both parent bodies, let's say. Okay, but what's really complicated is the brains of the brain of a robot that is driven by legs is very different than the brain of a robot that's driven by wheels. And this is really an engineering thing, is that the kind of control mechanism you need to drive legs is very different than the kind of control mechanism you need to drive wheels. So if you do try to do any kind of crossover between these two brains, you tend to get something that really just doesn't work at all. So we have to do some tweaks, if you like, in our evolutionary algorithm, in our design process, to try and handle this situation. So what we want to do is to be able to basically co-evolve, simultaneously evolve the body and the brain of the robot. So like I said earlier, because we don't really know whether the sort of balance of the intelligence should lie, whether it should be in a smart body or whether it should be in a smart brain or some combination of the two. So what we do, and I'm not going to go into the technical details of this, but rather than our artificial version of DNA, rather than specifying exactly what the body should look like, like it's this tall and it should have a wheel here and a leg there, the DNA is basically a set of instructions that describe how you should build a robot. So the DNA is basically a list of instructions which say what the shape of the skeleton should be, what kind of sensors you should have, what kind of actuators and where they should go on the body. And then those instructions can be decoded into a sort of recipe for building the robot. And it's exactly the same with the brain. So we have this, and it's these instructions that evolve. So the genome has two parts. It has a set of instructions to build the body and a set of instructions to build the brain. But the set of instructions to build the brain kind of take into account the body that's being built. So they're able to solve this problem. So when the brain instructions are decoded, they take into account how many legs or wheels the robot's got, and they use that to design the controller. So this basically allows us to have something that is capable of creating new robots that are offspring from two parents that might have very, very different features. And it's these instructions that are evolving in our evolutionary process. So because that doesn't always work perfectly, if we take any given genome, we first decode it into a body, it might look, some of the bodies can be really bizarre. They might have wheels on the head, essentially. Sometimes this is useless, sometimes it's helpful because it means that the robot can actually turn over and it can actually, you know, onto its back, for example, and carry on moving. We decode the brain into essentially a neural network that basically takes account of the number of sensors that the robot has, which basically are the inputs to the neural network, and the number of wheels or legs it's got, which are the outputs. And this will give us some crude form of control. But then we basically use this training process to say, okay, we've got this offspring robot, this newborn robot that's got this basic brain, it's got a new body. So then we apply a new algorithm that basically just tries to improve the neural network that was inherited through this evolutionary process. So this learning algorithm can be any kind you like. In computer science, there's a lot of different algorithms that can do this. It could, in fact, be evolutionary. It could be something from more kind of mathematical computer science, like Bayesian optimization. Reinforcement learning is another algorithm, which is basically a process that basically just allows you to improve what you've already got. So each brain is allowed a short amount of time to basically undergo this learning process by an algorithm of choice to improve its inherited controller before it's released into an arena, and then we score it on the ability to do some tasks. And we also use another trick, which is not really available in biological evolution. So because we have what I kind of refer to as different robot species, you know, a robot with all legs or all wheels, or perhaps a robot with 2 legs and 2 wheels, we keep a kind of external library where for each species, we basically describe a species by quite a naive descriptor that just says how many sensors, grippers, things that allow it to hold things, and legs and wheels does the robot have. So, you know, it doesn't take any account of the shape of the skeleton. We could make more complex ones, and there's good and bad reasons for doing that. But at the moment, we just work with a fairly basic description, and then we essentially keep a 4-dimensional grid, but basically each square corresponds to a species of robot now. So here we've got one that's got 2 legs and 1 wheel. And every time our evolutionary process comes across a robot that kind of fits one of these descriptors, after we've learned its neural network, we store that neural network in this external library. So if we come across in the future a new robot that has also 1 wheel and 2 legs, it might have a completely different skeleton, so it won't work the same as the previous robot, but we can bootstrap this learning process by basically taking from the library a controller that in the past has been shown to be good for that species. So this is obviously not a thing you observe in biological evolution, although it can be thought of in some sense as a form of cultural evolution, where there's some kind of exchange of knowledge over time periods where the knowledge has been learned during the individual's lifetime. Okay, so that's basically the technical part of how we do this. And I'll show you a robot at the end that we've evolved. I just wanted to touch a little bit in the last few minutes about the ethics of this process, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, crikey, this is not what we need in the world. And actually some of those newspaper articles that I showed you earlier did spawn some other newspaper articles, which basically raised these questions in ways that we would have preferred they didn't. Let's say, particularly this kind of robots wiping out mankind kind of thing. But it actually raises a serious point, because if you are going to produce some kind of automated technology like this that can really evolve populations of robots, of course you should think about the ethics of the entire thing and what you can do to stop such a thing getting out of control and how you manage it in the first place. So it's actually really important to think about the ethics, and this has been embedded in what we do from the start. So of course the easiest thing is you have a big red stop button that you can just press if something's going wrong. So if you remember back at the start, I talked about this ecosystem manager, which has a human in the loop, which is basically monitoring what is going on in the system. And that human should basically be able to push this stop button at any moment in time and stop the entire process. So it's really important for me, I think, that this process is never fully autonomous. Even if it was happening on a faraway planet, you could still have some control over the process by having a human monitoring and watching what's going on and controlling that. I guess there's some sort of implicit monitoring, because you have to build these robots out of something. You need a resource to build them out of. So if they build it out of plastic, then you can only build as many robots as you have plastic to build those robots. So also you have some other aspect of control by controlling the resource that the robot has, the system has access to, because it that gives it only finite means of making new robots. But it is absolutely something that is at the heart of what we do. And I think it's very important that in any kind of this automated technology, there is a human in the loop. So I just wanted to finish by talking a little bit about what this might mean in a sort of wider context. And so one of the things we've kind of really started to think about is, we've had instruments that allow us to study the stars in the forms of telescope, to study particles in the form of the cyclotron. So actually building a system like this might actually give us a different way of studying evolution with something like this EvoSphere that I just described, that allows evolution to proceed, things to be actually fabricated and evaluated in a physical world. So you could, in a sense, see it as a tool for studying evolution. And actually, if we look to biology now, right back in 1992, John Maynard Smith actually said that, we only have this one evolving system on our planet to study, and we can't wait for interstellar flight. So if we really want to start to generalize and learn some things about evolution, then perhaps we need to look to artificial systems to try and answer, or to try and gain insights, I guess would be a better way of putting it, into some of these systems. And actually, that's exactly what this biologist, John Long, did in this very nice short book published around 10 years ago, where he was studying fish, and he was trying to understand something about the evolutionary, the dynamics of these populations of fish. And he actually built these robotic fish and used them to answer some questions about what might be going on with the evolution in the biological system. So I think it's a nice, and the thing about doing things in this artificial system is much faster than biological evolution, and it's also easy to repeat things in a way that it's not in biology. So you can kind of get statistical information from by doing experiments. So I think I'll just leave it at that. All of this work basically happens because of an amazing bunch of postdocs that do all of the programming and the engineering. Perhaps if I can just leave you with one of the robots that I saw them evolving last week. So this is something that's just, this isn't the kind of nursery phase where it's learning how to walk. It's just being produced, and you can see it's capable of doing some kind of movement, and it gradually refines its movement over time to be able to kind of move and even like climb over some walls. So I will just leave you with that. There's many publications about this that you can find at that link there. So thank you very much for listening. Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, can do if you want. Yeah. Thank you very much for that talk. It was really interesting. Some really cool work that you guys are doing. Does anybody have any questions for Emma? Matt, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Emma. That was all really fascinating and really interesting. I should start by saying I'm quite well versed in evolutionary algorithms, but I know nothing about robotics. So one of the first things that strikes me about these situations where you're talking about a really remote situation you know nothing about is presumably the first thing you have to do is define what you might call the fitness function in the first place. So how do you determine in those situations what is actually a good robot?
Okay, so in a it's a very good question. In a real, okay, let me break it into two parts. So in the lab, what we do is we basically create setups of things that we think that the robot might have to do, and define it based on its fitness to do a task. In a far away place, you would still have to define a fitness function. It's harder. So I guess you don't know what it's going to encounter, but you know what you want the robot to achieve. So for example, let's say you've sent the robot there and you want it to collect some kind of minerals, it needs to dig for some kind of minerals. So you can basically define the fitness function based on its ability to do that task, that you know what the task is, but you don't know how it's going to have to behave in order to do that task. So you can define it based on the outcome without knowing what it will have to do in order to achieve that task. You can also break it down into a kind of bunch of have sort of a hierarchy of skills. Say, well, okay, we know you need to be able to move. We might know you need to be able to dig. You need to, I don't know, climb something. So you could also set sort of lower level fitness functions, which are basically your fitness at doing a whole bunch of different skills, and then a higher level process can combine those skills into the actual thing. But it's basically driven by the fitness of the task that you want it to achieve, or the low level skill that you want it to achieve.
Thank you. That's excellent.
Larry, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Emma, for coming in to talk to us. And we must be an unusual group for you to face. And it was your media, the media reaction to your work that brought us brought you to our attention. I've got a slightly follow-on question to Matt, which may be really trivial, but I was just wondering as I listened, and as you start to create species, is there scope for something equivalent to Darwinian sexual attraction, sexual evolution? Operates, you may get something, and oh no, this is why it's trivial. Something like the equivalent of a peacock evolving sort of extreme versions of components through the selection process.
Yes, exactly. Actually, and actually, this is something that we've kind of thought about, because there's this. You know, when you can control selection, you have obviously some choices of things that you can do, and I think this is actually one of the important things here. So is to try and figure out because also we want this evolution to be efficient, because it's you know, partly because of the materials cost and things, and so actually having something like this kind of sexual attraction and kind of having like almost like separate species co-evolving at the same time. So like within one species, you know, they all grow like, I don't know, really long legs, and within another species they focus on something else, and that things are then the kind of crossover and the breeding is more within the species. Once you've established some species, then it would be nice if each species kind of evolved a certain characteristic that kind of really expressed what was dominant within that species. Does that make sense? So our dream would be that basically we would get multiple species evolving, and when each species would have some sort of very obvious characteristic, which would, where, you know, the biggest or the tallest within that species or whatever would win. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Walter, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you for calling on me. So I don't know anything about robots, and I'm having a little difficulty formulating this question, Dr. Hart. So how do robots know how to make the correct decision versus a wrong decision? In other words, how is their intelligence wired into their body, so to speak? Now, I'm not talking about ethics. I'm just talking about, you know, doing the right thing.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, this comes back to the idea of this fitness function. They don't know what the right thing to do is. So as part of this evolutionary process, they're given, you know, they inherit a controller that basically says, given what I'm sensing from the environment, this is how I should react. Okay. So they don't know at that point whether, you know, that's basically the evolution is defining this controller. It's fed information from the sensors, it outputs some actions. They don't know whether that's good or bad at any point in time, until at some sort of end point where we say, okay, after 5 minutes, we're going to score the robot on how well they did at this task. Now, the robot doesn't know, it's not making kind of decisions, like logical decisions at any point. They're driven purely by this neural network. So it doesn't know why it did something right. It just knows at the end, it got a score of 10 or it got a score of 20. So it doesn't know why it achieved that score. It just knows it was a better robot than the other one. But there isn't actually and in some ways you could say this is some people would see as a downside of the system. It's essentially a black box. Evolution is producing this black box that defines the control. The robot, there's no logic in there. It's basically just looking for the right controller that gives the right behavior that achieves a high score. It's not making any assumptions about how it should happen or why it should happen. It's almost like, okay, well, I did this and I got this score. So the robot doesn't interpret that in any way as, oh, I got this score because I climbed up the rock and did that. It just knows that by having this form of control, it enables it to get a good score. Sometimes this can be, so we haven't seen this much in the robots, but you see this in the general field of evolution, particularly in simulation with robots, is that evolution is very good at exploiting kind of things that you might not want it to. And so it can actually kind of achieve a task in a way that is essentially, for example, sometimes exploiting some fault in the physics of your simulator, you know, that nobody ever knew existed, and that allows the robot to, I don't know, somersault in the air because the simulator is actually broken. But evolution will generally quite quickly discover like the easiest way to do something, even though it has no idea why it's actually doing that thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. John, would you like to ask?
Yes, thank you very much for giving us your time for this, because it's been absolutely fascinating. My question, I suppose, is about natural selection, that in the living world, there's a sort of high cost of natural selection.
Yes.
That most are dropping out, some are going through, and yet, is there an analog to that in what you're doing, or is there any advantage in building that in?
Yeah, it's exactly the same, that there's a very high cost, because for us, you know, every time we want to build a robot, like it takes a lot of time actually, and a lot of materials. So we do have some filters on this that we actually filter out. We actually take every robot that's about to be built and run it very quickly through a simulator just to see like basic things like, can it move at all? Is it likely to be good? Because this cost of actually spending 5 hours printing it and assembling it together is basically too high to pay. So I guess we artificially impose that cost, and we get rid of things that are unlikely to be, so that won't work at all. Okay, so it's not things that you know, evolution only works if you have diversity, so you have to balance this with maintaining a diverse population of robots. But there isn't really, it's not really worth paying the price of, for example, making a robot that has no means of moving, because, you know, maybe the evolutionary process would figure it out in the end, but there's no point building that robot because it will never work. So we kind of factor that in by having some filters on what is actually able to be built.
Great, thank you.
So you have another question, Mark?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I guess one of the most interesting things about this from a sort of archaeological or material culture perspective is this interface that you touched on various times in various ways between biological and cultural evolution.
Yeah.
So, you know, the virtual and physical dichotomy in the lab, the neural network controller, and even these sort of naive species descriptors that you can use to help. So I guess for us, it would be fascinating because of this idea that cultural evolution is somehow faster, or that learning can solve the problems that evolution solves, but faster. It'd be really interesting to know how much more efficient the process is when you actually couple those two systems. So when you have some sort of cultural element.
Yes. So we've actually done some experiments to quantify this, and there was a recent paper in the Cognitive and Development Systems IEEE journal, where we basically do exactly quantify this. So we have evolution plus learning plus this kind of cultural thing where we store the information, and you can borrow from that to bootstrap your learning, and you definitely get an advantage from the bootstrapping over the learning, and the learning definitely gives an advantage over the pure evolution.
Lovely. I'd very much like to see that paper. I'll email you after.
Yeah, so it's slightly tastic. So we found that the sort of magnitude of the effect was different depending. We had various different tasks, like, I don't know, obstacle avoidance, maze navigation, some different things, and I can't remember the ordering off the top of my head. The magnitude of the win was bigger in some environments than others, but there's always a benefit.
Excellent. Thank you.
I just noticed we're getting close to 2 o'clock, but do you mind taking
It's
another
absolutely
question?
fine.
I
It's
see that Lara's
absolutely
okay.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lara, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. This comes to your ethics section. And I was thinking about James Lovelock in his book Novacene. I can see from your face, you know where I'm going. And he says we shouldn't worry as humans that in the longer term we will be replaced as biological species with a machine based or cyborg. He said that's just inevitable, that evolution will select for these mechanisms which can solve problems far more quickly than us. So he said, just relax. I thought, well, okay, I might relax. But then there's a part in there he says, well, humans may end up being equivalent of a zoo or something for these cyborgs to watch as we look at it, something that this is where they came from ultimately. Do you have a sense of whether we should be worried about a runaway evolution of technology, in the sense that Lovelock's putting forward, though he's not saying that it's something that we should fear, it's something we should just embrace?
I don't think there'll be a run. I don't think there will be a runaway evolution like this. I think certainly we're going to have AI technologies that are doing incredible things and that will replace some human jobs, I guess. But like, I think we can make incredible things there. You know, I guess like, I don't know, Alexa, some of the vision stuff, you know, they're really good. But the thing with all these really good AI things is they're good at doing one specific thing. And there isn't anything that is good, you know, is as good as a 2-year-old in being able to do like 10 different tasks. Yeah. So we are for sure, well, I think for sure we will see more and more and more of these incredibly specialist systems that are incredible at doing some of the things that we do now, many of the things that we do now. Okay. But in this kind of, but I don't think we're anywhere near this generalist AI that will be able, so this is why I think things won't take over, because I think in order to take over, you need to be like humans. You need to be able to do this many different things and be good at many different things. And if you're only good at playing chess, or you're only good at recognizing images, then that's quite a long way from that. I think that there is like, especially in this design space, there's an amazing opportunity for like a co-creation of humans and machines working together, because humans have some kind of insight. Machines have the ability to like explore like millions and millions of things in fractions of a second that we can't as humans. But if you join those two things together, you've got a really nice way of like co-creating designs. And actually some of that work that I showed you with the Honda wing mirror is done in an interactive way with a human in the loop. So I don't really think that that machines will take over the world and will be consigned to the zoo. I think we will have a lot of AI in the world doing a lot of things, but I just think this generalist thing is very far away.
Okay, good, thank you.
I hope so anyway.
Do we have any more questions for Emma? No, it doesn't look like it at the moment, so that might be a good place for us to stop. So thank you very much, Emma, for the talk today. It's been really, really insightful for us. So thank you for coming along, and thank you everyone for joining us today as well. So please join us next week, where we've got a talk from Lucy Timbrell about paleoenvironments in the Middle Stone Age of East Africa. So thank you very much everyone for coming, and thank you again, Emma. And
thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to
soon.
talk to some different people. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.